Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, we'll be wandering into the safest jobs in ancient Rome, the silent authority of medieval queens who never remarried, the invisible boundaries that shaped sacred life long before modern law, and the careful rise of Queen Zenobia on the edges of empire, letting old times unfold at a pace meant for rest. But before you settle in, if you truly enjoy these calm journeys through history, you're welcome to like this video and subscribe, only if it feels right for you. And when you're ready, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always a quiet joy to see how many places and moments gather here together. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's slowly step into the past, softly, gently, together. Tonight begins with a small surprise. If you had been born in ancient Rome, the safest life available to you would probably not have involved swords, speeches, or glory. It would not have taken place in the Senate, or the army, or even in the marketplace where voices rose and arguments echoed between stone walls. Instead, the safest place to stand was usually somewhere quieter. Indoors, slightly behind someone more powerful than yourself, close enough to influence events, but not close enough to be blamed for them. In the ancient city, survival often depends less on strength and more on position. Not position in the sense of rank alone, but position in the sense of where you stood in a room, whose voice you carried, whose letters you wrote, whose secrets you protected, and whose meals you tasted before they reached the table. This was a world where danger did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a rumor written on a wall. Sometimes it appears as a letter opened too soon. Sometimes it followed a careless joke told at the wrong dinner. So the people who lived longest were often the ones who learned how to move carefully between other people's importance, like quiet attendants walking between lamps in a darkened hall. And if you look closely enough, you begin to notice something else. The safest professions in Rome were rarely the most visible ones. They belonged instead to scribes who shaped memory without appearing in it, attendants who arranged meetings without being remembered at them, and caretakers who guarded rituals that no one else fully understood. As the night unfolds, you will walk beside some of these figures. A letter writer who decides how apologies sound, a widow whose silence becomes authority, a temple attendant keeps invisible boundaries intact, and far away from Rome itself, a queen who discovers how to move carefully between empires without stepping outside them too soon. But for now, the story begins in a quieter place. It begins with a small wooden tablet warmed beside a lamp, and with someone who writes for a living. You are standing inside a Roman house at the end of the afternoon. Outside, the street is still warm from the day's heat, and voices drift through the doorway in uneven fragments. Somewhere nearby, a cartwheel scrapes against stones. Someone is arguing about grain prices. Someone else is laughing too loudly. The city never quite settles, even when the light begins to soften. But inside the house, the air feels calmer. A small oil lamp burns steadily beside you. Its flame is narrow and patient. In front of you rests a thin wooden tablet coated with a layer of dark wax that has just begun to soften in the warmth. A stylus lies beside it, ready to move. You are not here to speak. You are here to write. In ancient Rome, this was already a kind of protection. Most people spend their lives outdoors. They carried baskets through crowded streets. They worked in workshops full of smoke. They shouted across markets. They stood in lines. They negotiated with strangers. And all of this meant exposure to weather, to accidents, to conflict, and sometimes to suspicion. But you were indoors. You belonged to a household. And belonging to a household meant something very specific in Roman society. It meant you were attached to a center of influence. You were inside a circle where decisions were made quietly before they appeared in public. A Roman writer named Pliny once described how letters passed through the hands of trusted secrets before they reached their destinations. Those secrets were not senators. They did not command soldiers. Yet they stood close enough to important conversations that they could shape how messages sounded, how apologies were phrased, and how requests were remembered. Sometimes, survival began simply by holding the stylus. Besides you, the wax surface has softened enough now that you can begin. Lucius is already writing. He is young, careful, and used to waiting. His hand moves slowly across the tablet as he copies a sentence that his patron dictated moments only earlier. The sentence is not long. It is not dramatic. It is simply an explanation to another household about why a dinner invitation must be declined. Yet the tone matters. If the sounds refuse too cold, the relationship may weaken. If it sounds too eager, it may suggest dependence. So Lucius adjusts a single phrase, replacing one word with another that feels softer when spoken aloud. No one watching him would call this power, but it is a kind of safety measure, because in Rome, reputation traveled faster than footsteps, and the people who shaped reputation even quietly were often protected by the same households they served. Over time, positions like this became part of what historians sometimes describe as the hidden structure of Roman domestic life. Large homes did not operate through noise or command alone. They depend on networks of readers, copyists, tutors, librarians, and clerks who carry information carefully between rooms. Some of them were free citizens. Some were formerly enslaved specialists who had earned trust through skill. Many were allowed to keep small personal savings, something Romans called a private reserve, which slowly accumulated coin by coin across the years. This reserve did not make them powerful, but it made them patient. And patience, in a city as crowded as Rome, could feel like a second doorway quietly opening somewhere behind you. Meals were prepared, invitations were delivered, contracts were copied, schedules were reminded. And all the while, the people who handled these tasks remained just slightly outside the center of attention, where danger moves more slowly. Roman society in this way resembles a carefully arranged table. At the center were the hosts, brightly visible. Around them sat the guests, each aware of the others, but along the edges moved the attendants who guaranteed that dishes arrived at the right moment and conversations flowed without interruption. They were not the focus of the evening. Yet without them, nothing would have been held together. Safety often lives at the edge of the table. And as you stand beside the lamp, watching the wax surface cool beneath Lucius's final sentence, you begin to understand something that many Romans already knew without saying aloud. The most secure lives were not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they belonged to people who learned how to remain close enough to importance to be necessary, and distant enough from it to remain unnoticed. And elsewhere in the same house, beyond the doorway and deeper inside the corridors, others were practicing a different kind of careful work, preparing gatherings where silence mattered even more than words. Before long, you may find yourself walking there as well. Before sunrise, the house is still. You wake earlier than most people here, not because anyone ordered you to, but because writing prefers quiet air. Lamps burn more steadily when the corridors are empty. Voices carry less uncertainty when they are spoken before breakfast begins. The small knife beside your tablet is not a weapon. It is used only for trimming the narrow edge of your reed pen so that the ink flows evenly across the surface of the wax or parchment. It is a simple object, almost forgettable. Yet without it, the letters you form would grow uneven, and uneven letters could change how a message feels when someone reads it aloud later. In Rome, feeling mattered. A sentence could travel across the city faster than its writer. It could pass through servants' hands, cross courtyards, enter dining rooms, and settle quietly in another household long before the person who dictated it ever arrived. By the time it reached its destination, it had already begun shaping expectations. So the person who wrote the sentence mattered more than anyone admitted openly. Lucius is already awake, but he sits beside a narrow window where the first light is only beginning to appear, holding the reed pen carefully between his fingers. His patron dictated a reply the evening before, after a long dinner conversation that wandered through politics, property disputes, and several carefully avoided dissents. The reply must now be copied cleanly before it leaves the house. It is a message about a boundary, not a wall, not a road. A boundary between two families who have been friendly for years but recently stopped trusting each other quite as easily. Lucius read the sentence again before writing it. He replaced one word that sounded too direct. he softens another that might sound uncertain. When he finishes, the message no longer feels like refusing. It feels like patience. No one watching him would say he changed history. But he changed the weather between two households. In Roman cities, relationships often shift the way morning air shifts before a storm. No one announced the change. No one points to a single moment when everything became different. Instead, tone adjusted slowly. Invitations arrived later than expected. Replies grew shorter. Names disappeared from guest lists. And somewhere along the way, someone like Lucius had already shaped the sentences that made those changes possible. This kind of work rarely appears in public records. Senators did not stand in the forum to praise their letter writers. Generals did not celebrate scribes in triumphal processes. Yet Roman authors quietly acknowledge how necessary these figures were. One well-known writer described trusted secretaries who remained close enough to private conversation that they could prepare correspondence almost before instructions were finished. They were not only copying words, they were arranging memory. Because once a letter exists, it can be preserved. It could be read again months later. It could be shown to allies. It could even be used as proof that a promise had once been made. Writing slows time in a world that usually moves very quickly. And the people who controlled writing gained something rare: stability. Inside large households, scribes are often handled more than messages. They keep track of guest visits, payments, library scrolls, travel plans, and contracts. Some of them accompany their patrons on journeys. Others remain behind to maintain order in rooms filled with documents that no visitor was allowed to see without permission. This makes them valuable in a particular way, not powerful in the sense of command, but necessary in the sense of continuity. When political winds shifted across the city, the household still needed someone who remembered which agreements existed and which promises had already been made. Sometimes that someone was the quietest person in the building. Lucius finishes his copy just as the first footsteps begin echoing in the hallway outside. Servants are moving again. Doors are opening. Somewhere nearby, someone is grinding grain for the morning meal. He warms the edge of the wax tablet slightly with the lamp so the surface smooths again, erasing the practice marks that no one else needs to see. Only the final version will travel across the courtyard later today. It will arrive carrying his careful adjustments with it, although no one receiving it will know his name. That was part of the safety. In Roman society, visibility could be dangerous. People who speak loudly in public spaces attract attention. People who argued too confidently risked being reminded at the wrong moment. But people who write carefully inside private rooms often remain protected by the household they served. They were like steady air moving through a house before anyone opened the windows. Present everywhere, noticed nowhere. And once you begin to recognize how many decisions depend on written words, you start to see something else as well. Not everyone who shaped Roman life did compared with speeches. Some did it with invitations. Some did it with apologies. And some did it by deciding exactly how long a message should pause before it reached another pair of hands. Elsewhere in the same city, however, another group of specialists worked even closer to delicate situations, arranging evenings where reputation itself had to be handled as carefully as glass. Late in the afternoon, another part of the house begins to change its rhythm. The corridors grow quieter again, but not with the calm of early morning. This quiet has prepared inside it. Linen is folded, lamps are checked, small glass vessels are opened carefully and closed again. Someone walks past carrying a tray that smells faintly of crushed herbs and warmed oil. An evening gathering is being arranged. In Rome, gatherings like this were never simply about food. They were about reputation. Who arrived first mattered. Who sat closest to the host mattered. Who spoke too loudly mattered even more. And behind all of this stood people whose task was not to be remembered. One of them is Marcia. She stands near the edge of a bathing room where steam has already begun to soften the air. In her hands, she holds a folded cloth that has been lightly scented with oil pressed from flowers that grew far from the city. The scent is gentle enough not to linger too long, but strong enough to signal care. She does not decide who enters the room. She does not decide who speaks first. Yet the comfort she prepares shapes how those conversations will unfold. Roman writers sometimes joked about the elaborate grooming habits of wealthy households, but beneath those jokes was something practical. Clean skin, trimmed hair, and carefully chosen scents signaled belonging. They told guests that they were welcome in a space where attention had already been arranged for them, and arranging attention was a skill. Some attendants specialized in trimming body hair for elite clients, a task that requires patience and precision rather than speed. Others prepare cosmetics, adjusted garments, or carried mirrors so that guests could correct small details before entering a dining room. These were not dramatic roles, yet they placed attendants close to moments when reputation was most fragile. A single careless gesture could be remembered for years. So the people who worked in these spaces learned how to move as if they were stitching invisible thread between conversations, keeping everything aligned without drawing notice to themselves. Even the most private gatherings depend on careful coordination. There were attendants who arranged seating cushions in the correct order before guests arrived. Others ensured that certain individuals did not meet each other too early in the evening, allowing dissents to soften before introductions became necessary. Some households even relied on specialists who helped organize particularly delicate celebrations, where secrecy itself became part of the arrangement. Roman satirists sometimes describe these events with exaggerated humor, but their descriptions still reveal something important. Even pleasure required structure, even laughter required timing, and timing creates safety. Because when you understood exactly when to enter a room, when to leave a conversation, and when to remain quietly near a doorway without speaking, you became someone the household depended on. Marcia places the scented cloth beside a bronze basin and steps back. Soon, guests will arrive from different parts of the city. Some will bring news, some will bring uncertainty. Some will bring stories that should not be repeated outside these walls. But before any of that begins, there must be a moment of comfort that allows everyone to feel settled enough to speak. Her work creates that moment. Elsewhere in the same household, another specialist prepares something even more unusual. In certain elite circles, people of distinctive appearance were sometimes introduced during gatherings as signs of wealth and access to distant regions. Poets like Martial mentioned entertainers and attendants whose rarity made them symbols of prestige rather than ordinary servants. Managing such introductions required tact. These individuals were not objects, although they were often treated as curiosities. Someone always had to ensure that their presence remained appropriate to the mood of the evening. Again, the task depends on judgment rather than force. Many roles like this leave no inscriptions behind. No monuments recorded the names of the people who arranged cushions, adjusted lamps, or ensured that conversation flowed without interruption. Yet the household that relies on them often protects them carefully, because replacing such quiet skill was difficult. Discretion could not be taught quickly. It grew slowly, like a craft learned through repetition. Over time, the safest attendants were the ones who understood how to appear only when needed and disappear again before anyone thought to look for them. They learned how to listen without reacting. They learned how to anticipate requests before they were spoken. They learned how to step aside without seeming to retreat. Safety in these rooms depends on rhythm. The evening continues. Steam drifts upward along painted walls. Lamps brighten as the sky darkens outside. Somewhere deeper in the house, voices begin to gather around the first shared cups of wine. No one will mention the attendants who prepare the space for them. No one will describe the careful sequence of small gestures that make the gathering possible. Yet those gestures hold the evening together the way hidden stitching holds fabric in place. And in Rome, the people who knew how to stitch evenings like this often remained close to power without standing inside it. Not everyone who served elite household items worked with comfort alone, however. Some worked closer to danger itself, quietly ensuring that food, games, and even grief unfolded without conflict. Even in the safest Roman houses, there were moments when caution became especially important. Meals were one of them. A dining room might appear calm from a distance, cushions arranged neatly, lamps placed at comfortable heights, plates set out with care. Yet everyone understood that the evening meal was not only about eating, it was also about trust. Trust in the host, trust in the guests, and sometimes trust in the person who tasted the first bite. In certain elite household, especially during uncertain political times, a trusted attendant would quietly sample food before it reached the table. This was not done with drama. No one announced it aloud. It happened as naturally as pouring wine. A small portion lifted, a brief pause. Then the dish continued its journey towards the guests. The gesture was simple, but it carried reassurance. Writers describing imperial household later mentioned attendants whose role included protecting their patrons from hidden threats at the table. Whether danger was truly expected or only imagined, the presence of such figures created calm. And calm in Rome was often worth more than certainty. Elsewhere in the same house, another kind of protection was taking place. Dice games had already begun. Roman evenings frequently included games played with small carved cubes that clicked softly against wooden boards. These games were meant to entertain, yet they also carry risks. Wagers could grow larger than expected. Friendly rivalry could become argument. Argument could become something louder. So some relied on someone whose quiet responsibility was to keep the game fair. He did not command the players. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he watched the movement of the dice, confirmed the agreed rules, and reminded participants gently when excitement began to drift too far from courtesy. He protected the atmosphere, and protecting atmosphere in a Roman house was another form of safety. Across the city, however, not every specialist worked among laughter. In a shaded courtyard near a different house, Daphnis is practicing. He stands alone at first, repeating a line slowly until the sound settles into the right shape. His task is not to invent grief. His task is to guide it. Professional mourners had existed in Roman funeral traditions for generations. Earlier writers described how families sometimes invited trained voices to lead public expressions of sorrow, helping ceremonies unfold with dignity and order. These mourners understood rhythm. They understood pauses. They understood how to create a sound that allows others to join without hesitation. Grief, when shared carefully, became easier to carry. Daphnis lowers his voice and begins again, this time more softly. The courtyard walls return the sound to him with a faint echo, as if confirming that the tone is correct. Soon he will stand beside a family whose loss cannot easily be spoken. When he begins the lament, others will follow. And once again, safety will appear in an unexpected place, because even mourning required guidance. Elsewhere still, another kind of specialist waited near the entrance of a busy street. Some people came to him with questions, not questions about grain prices or property lines, but questions about uncertainty. Should they travel tomorrow? Should they accept an invitation? Should they trust a message they received earlier that week? He answered by reading signs. Diviners and interpreters of small omens were familiar figures in Roman cities. One well-known Roman speaker once remarked on how often people consult such advisors before making decisions that felt too important to risk alone. Whether their predictions were completely believed or only partly, they offered something valuable. They offered reassurance. Reassurance, like good timing at a dinner table, can change the direction of a day. And then there were the writers who never signed their names. Across the walls of Pompeii, many centuries later preserved beneath layers of ash, short messages still remain. Some are greetings, some are jokes, some are arguments, some are reminders of affection. Together they form a quiet record of how people spoke when they believed no one official was listening. In Rome itself, similar markings once appeared across neighborhoods, shaping rumor and reputation in ways that formal speeches never could. Someone always said that to them. Someone always chose the words. Although their identities rarely survived, their presence reminds us that even anonymous writing influenced how understood themselves. Protection, in Rome, did not always come from soldiers. Sometimes it came from someone who tasted first, sometimes from someone who watched the dice, sometimes from someone who helped grief find its voice, and sometimes from someone who placed a sentence on a wall and stepped away before anyone turned to look. Yet beyond meals and games and ceremonies, there were also people whose work protected the city itself in quieter ways still, guiding water, stones, and even unfamiliar scents through streets that never truly slept. In a city as large as Rome, safety depends not only on letters and conversation, it also depended on water and on stone, and sometimes on things people prefer not to discuss at all. You are walking now through a quieter corner of the city, away from the polished floors of private houses and into a public building where voices echo differently. The doorway is wide, but the interior feels surprisingly orderly. Along the walls runs a continuous row of smooth stone seats, each carefully shaped and evenly spaced. Beneath them, a narrow channel of water flows steadily past, carrying everything away before it has time to linger. This is a public latrine. It may not sound like a place connected to safety, yet in Roman cities, structures like this help protect health, reduce conflict over shared space, and maintain the rhythms of daily life for thousands of people at once. And someone always worked here. Gaius sits near the entrance on a small wooden stool, a shallow bowl of coins resting beside him. He does not hurry anyone. He does not speak loudly. His task is simply to watch, to maintain order, and to collect small payments that help keep the facility supplied and clean. The water continues moving past his feet with a quiet, steady sound. Public sanitation in Rome depends on constant motion like this. Water entered, carried waste away, and left again before the city could feel its presence too strongly. It was a system that required supervision, attention, and patience. The people who managed it were rarely praised. Yet they worked inside one of the most reliable parts of the urban environment. Reliability itself could be a form of safety. Nearby, another kind of collector is at work. Along certain streets, large containers stand waiting beside workshops that process cloth. People passing through the neighborhood pause briefly beside them, emptying small vessels before continuing on their way. The contents are not wasted. Instead, they were gathered and carried toward dyeing and cleaning industries where they became part of a strong washing liquid used to treat fabrics. Roman writers later mentioned how this material became important enough to support a small tax collected under imperial authority. The tax itself was simple. The material was gathered, transported, and reused. In time, it became part of the ordinary economy of the city. It may seem surprising now, but to Romans, it was practical. Even strong-smelling resources had their place, and the people who supervised their collection held steady positions within the urban system. From here, the road leads naturally toward another kind of building filled with water and steam. The bathhouse. You step inside through a wide entrance hall where the air already feels warmer than the street outside. Voices move gently across tiled walls. Footsteps echo more softly here. Somewhere deeper inside the complex, warm water flows through hidden channels beneath the floor, heating the rooms above it without smoke or flame appearing in sight. Bathhouses were among the most important social centers in Roman cities. They were places where people met friends, discussed news, negotiated agreements, and rested after long days of work. Yet they depend on careful maintenance to remain welcoming. Attendants like Marcia move quietly between rooms carrying folded cloth, small containers of oil, and wooden tools used for cleaning the skin after bathing. They check the temperature of the pools. They guide visitors toward the correct sequence of spaces. They ensure that lamps remain lit where light is needed most. Their presence shaped comfort, roue played, and conversation shaped reputation, because bathhouses were not silent places. They were filled with quiet exchanges that helped households maintain relationships across the city. Being trusted inside such spaces meant belonging to a network where news traveled gently but quickly. Roman inscriptions preserve the names of some attendants who worked in these environments. Their responsibilities were practical, but their position placed them close to the daily movement of through urban life. Like the steady channel beneath the stone benches of the latrine, they remain part of a system that carries unseen currents through the city. Gaius finishes counting the last coins in his bowl and sets them aside carefully. Outside, the street has begun to brighten again as the afternoon continues. People pass through the doorway in a slow rhythm, each pausing only briefly before returning to their own paths. From where he sits, that he can watch the movement of the neighborhood without stepping into its arguments or uncertainties. That distance is part of his safety. In Rome, some of the most stable lives were built not on prestige, but on reliability. Water flowed, cloth was cleaned, rooms were warmed, benches were maintained, and the people who keep these moving systems remain quietly necessary, like small stars whose light help travelers find their way without ever drawing attention to themselves. Yet beyond water and steam and stone, there were also people whose work connected the city not only to itself, but to its temples, its rituals, and even to animals brought from far beyond the horizon. At the edge of a Roman temple courtyard, the air moves differently. It is not quieter in the ordinary sense. People are still speaking, and the sandals still scrape softly across stone. Birds still settle along the roofline above the entrance. Yet something in the atmosphere asks for slower movement. Visitors pause before stepping forward. Hands adjust clothing, voices lower without being told to do so. You're standing near the doorway, holding a small bronze spoon. Its bowl is shallow and darkened slightly from years of use. Inside, it rests a measured portion of incense that will soon be placed into a brazier where thin threads of smoke will rise toward the open sky above the courtyard. Beside you stands Tiberius. He has already checked the small container twice to make sure the portion is correct. Not too much, not too little. Ritual depends on balance, and balance depends on attention. In Roman temples, for attendants like him helped organize movement between ordinary space and sacred space. Visitors did not simply walk in and speak as they pleased. There were moments for offering, moments for waiting, and moments when entry was not permitted at all. Someone had to know the difference. Temple service rarely looked dramatic from the outside. Yet, it requires memory. Schedules of festivals changed across the year. Certain offerings owned to certain days. Certain visitors required preparation before they could approach particular areas of the sanctuary. Attendants remember these patterns, and reminds patterns create reliability. Reliability created trust. Over time, temple workers became familiar figures within their neighborhoods. People they are not recognized because they spoke loudly, but because they stood in the same place each morning, guiding others gently through rituals that connected household to the wider order of the city. Some Roman inscriptions preserve the names of individuals who served in temples for many years, maintaining lamps, preparing offerings, or supervising access to sacred objects. Their tasks were careful rather than hurried. They shaped the rhythm of religious life without drawing attention to themselves. Tiberius lifts the incense spoon slightly and waits. A small group approaches the doorway. One visitor steps forward first, another remains behind, watching the smoke rise before deciding whether to follow. These small hesitations are familiar. People often pause before entering sacred spaces, as if adjusting themselves to a different kind of time. Inside the courtyard, the sound of footsteps changes again. Stone reflects movement differently here. Voices soften. Even laughter becomes quieter without anyone explaining why. Temple attendants learned to listen for these changes. Sound told them when a group was ready to enter. Sound told them when a ceremony had begun. Sound told them when it was time to close the gates again until the next offering. Safety in places like this depends on listening as much as speaking. Not far away, however, another group of specialists worked with a very different kind of responsibility. Outside the city gates, along roads that stretched toward distant provinces, animals were arriving. Some had traveled across deserts, some had crossed rivers, some had been guided slowly through forests before reaching the suburbs of Rome itself. They were not brought here for farming or transport. They were brought for spectacle. Imperial arenas required animals that most citizens will never see anywhere else. Someone had to care for them before they appeared in public. Handlers moved quietly among wooden enclosures where unfamiliar sounds echoed at night. They learned how each creature reacts to crowds, to confinement, and to travel. They prepared feeding routines that allowed animals to remain calm enough to be guided safely through narrow corridors beneath large amphitheaters. This work required patience. It also demanded courage. Yet, it was not courageous. It was the steady kind that grows through repetition, the kind that comes from learning how to stand near powerful creatures without startling them. In many cases, these handlers remain attached to the same institutions for years. developing knowledge that could not easily be replaced. Their familiarity with animals from distant regions made them valuable members of the logistical networks that supported public spectacles across the empire. Even when crowds gathered above them in thousands, their own work remains hidden below. Like temple attendants, they operate close to important transitions. One group guides people toward the presence of the gods, the other guided animals toward the presence of the crowd. Both required careful timing, both depended on trust, and both offered a form of protection that came from being necessary rather than visible. Tiberius finishes placing the incense into the brazier. A thin line of smoke rises slowly into the morning air, carrying a scent that signals the beginning of the day's first offering. Visitors step forward one at a time, following a path that has been walked so often it feels almost like music, repeated gently across generations. Sound moves through the courtyard again. Footsteps, whispers, breathing, each one part of a rhythm that temple attendants learn to recognize long before anyone thinks to ask their names. Across the city, workers in bathhouses, courtyards, kitchens, and writing rooms are beginning their own routines as well. Together, they form a quiet network of people who understand where to stand, when to move, and how to remain close enough to importance to be protected by it. And once you begin to see how many lives depend on these careful positions, it becomes easier to understand why safety in the ancient world so often meant learning where the invisible boundaries were, and how to remain just inside them. Sometimes the safest place near power was not beside the throne. Sometimes it was one careful step behind it. In a medieval royal court, widowhood did not begin with silence alone. It began with clothing. You are standing inside a chamber where the windows are narrow and the light arrives slowly across the floor. The walls are hung with heavy fabric that softens sound, and the air still carries a faint trace of incense from the chapel nearby. On a carved wooden chair rests a folded veil the color of deep shadow. It is heavier than it appears. Once it is worn, it changes everything. When a queen became a widow, her life did not simply pause. It shifted into a new shape that others could immediately recognize. The bright fabrics of celebration disappeared. Jewels were set aside. Gold thread disappeared from sleeves and collars. In their place came darker cloth that signaled loyalty to the past as much as distance from the future. This transformation was not private, it was meant to be seen. Courts watched closely for signs that mourning had begun correctly. Chroniclers sometimes recorded the moment a queen changed her clothing because the change marked more than grief. It marked continuity. It told everyone who depended on the stability of the kingdom that the memory of the king still mattered, and that the order of the court had not dissolved with his passing. Nearby, an attendant named Ellen is folding something smaller. It is a ribbon that once formed part of a coronation garment. She smooths its edges slowly before placing it into a wooden chest where other ceremonial items are already stored. The chest will remain closed for a long time. No one has told her this directly. She understood it simply by watching the queen's clothing change. Certain colors do not return quickly. In medieval courts, garments speak as clearly as proclamations. A widow's black veil was not only a sign of sorrow, it was a signal of loyalty. It reassured allies that the queen did not intend to replace the king's memory too quickly. It reassures rivals that she will not seek sudden alliances that might disturb the balance of power around the throne. Silence became part of this language as well. Queens who had once appeared beside their husbands during ceremonies now moved more carefully through public spaces. They participated in services. They listened to advisors. They received visitors at measured intervals. Their voices did not disappear, but they were used differently, like bells that sounded only at certain hours. This discipline creates safety, because courts were places where every gesture carried meaning. A smile offered too soon after a king's death might be misunderstood. A conversation held too privately with a visiting noble might invite suspicion. Even a change in seating position during a feast could suggest a shift in allegiance. So mourning created a structure that helped others understand how to behave around her. Historians who studied records of medieval household noted that widowed queens often occupied a distinct place within the court hierarchy. They were neither removed from authority nor fully inside its center. Instead, they stood at a distance that allowed them to remain visible without appearing threatening. This was a delicate position, and it requires careful performance. Ellen closes the wooden chest and steps back quietly. The ribbon inside it once caught the light during ceremonies attended by ambassadors and bishops. Now it rests in darkness beside gloves that will not be worn again for some time. The queen herself sits near the window, her hands folded in her lap, listening as a clerk reading letters from neighboring territories. She does not interrupt. She doesn't hurry him. Her stillness is not emptiness, it is attention. Like across Europe, similar scenes unfolded in different courts whenever a ruler died. Queens enter a period of mourning that could last months or years, depending on custom and circumstance. During this time, their appearance reassured subjects that continuity remained possible. The kingdom had lost a king, but it had not lost its memory. Memory in courts like these was a form of protection, because dynasties depend on it. Widowhood allows a queen to embody that memory without competing with the authority of future rulers. She could remain present without appearing ambitious. She could remain regarded without appearing dangerous. Her clothing told everyone around her how to interpret her position before she spoke a single word. Outside the chamber, footsteps move slowly along the corridor as messengers arrive from distant estates. They carry news about harvests, disputes, and border concerns that still require attention. None of these matters have stopped simply because the king is gone, and so the queen continues listening. Her veil absorbs the morning light instead of reflecting it. Her voice remains measured. Her presence becomes something steady that others can rely on while the court adjusts itself to a different future. Over time, this stillness begins to change how people see her. She is no longer only the king's companion, she becomes the keeper of his memory. And in many courts, that memory carried a quiet authority strong enough to shape decisions long after the ceremonies of mourning had ended. Morning light reaches the writing table slowly. It moves across the surface of folded letters, across a narrow knife used for trimming parchment edges, and finally, across a small ring carefully placed beside a shallow dish of softened wax. The ring is not decorative. It carries an image pressed into its surface, an image that can close agreements and confirm decisions without a spoken command. You are standing inside a chamber where the queen receives petitions. Her clothing still follows the discipline of mourning. The veil remains dark. The jewels are absent. Yet the room feels itself different from yesterday. Messengers are waiting closer to the doorway. Clerks are arranging documents in careful stacks. A steward stands nearby holding a roll of parchment that has already been read once aloud and will soon be read again. Widowhood has not removed responsibility. It has changed its shape. In many medieval kingdoms, when a king died leaving a young heir behind, the queen did not disappear from political life. Instead, she became a guardian of continuity. She listens to advisors, she confirmed decisions, she issued instructions that protected estates until the heir was old enough to rule independently. She ruled without claiming the crown again. This distinction matters because ruling in the name of a child did not threaten the structure of the kingdom. It preserves it. The queen's authority appears temporary, careful, and protective rather than ambitious. And that appearance made it acceptable to those who might otherwise have resisted her presence in government affairs. The wax beside the ring is ready now. A clerk finishes reading the final lines of a document describing a boundary dispute between two neighboring estates. The dissent has lasted for months. Crops cannot be planted safely until the boundary is settled. Messengers have traveled back and forth along the same road more times than anyone can easily remember. The queen listens until the last sentence is complete. Then she nodded. The clerk lowers the parchment onto the table. Warm wax is poured into a small circle near the bottom edge. The queen lifts the ring, presses it gently into the surface, and holds it there for a moment longer than necessary to ensure the impression remains clear. When she lifted her hand again, the decision became official. No crown was required. Across medieval Europe, widowed queens issued charters like this one, confirming land ownership, protecting monasteries, and resolving disputes that affected entire regions. Historians studying these documents note how often the queen's authority appears in phrases that describe her as acting in protection of her child's inheritance or in memory of her husband's rule. Language helped shape acceptance. It allows her to act while remaining within expectations. Nearby, the steward unfolds another letter. This one concerns a distant estate where tenants ask permission to repair a damaged mill. The repair cannot wait until the heir grows older. Grain must be ground before winter returns. Again, the queen listens. Her decisions move slowly but steadily, like careful hands shaping wood along a familiar grain. Nothing is forced, nothing is rushing. Yet by the end of the morning, several matters that once seemed uncertain now have direction again. This was one of the quiet strengths of widowhood. It creates a space where authority could exist without appearing to compete with future kings. Writers examined records from royal household, later observed that widowed queens often managed estates for many years. They supervised income from lands that supported monasteries. They confirmed travel permissions for messengers crossing their territories. They even arranged marriages for younger members of the court whose alliances influence regional stability. None of these actions require public display. They required recognition. Recognition came through seals, signatures, and carefully worded letters that moved outward from the palace, like threads connecting distant places back to the center of the kingdom. You can hear the soft sound of wax cooling again as another document is placed aside. The chamber remains quiet except for the turning of parchment pages and the occasional murmur of clerks confirming details with another. Outside the window, a bell sounds somewhere within the city walls, marking the passing of another hour. Inside the chamber, time feels different. Here, accumulates slowly. The queen presses her seal once more. This time confirms a gift of land to a monastery that has prayed for the royal family since before her marriage. The gift is modest. The gesture is deliberate. It strengthens a relationship that may be needed later when advice or support becomes necessary. Authority often moves through gestures like this: small, repeated, steady. Those who watched her closely understood that she was not withdrawing from the kingdom's life. She was shaping it carefully from a position that appeared respectful rather than commanding. Her mourning veil remains unchanged, yet her influence extends across fields, villages, and monasteries far beyond the palace walls. This balance requires attention. Every decision she made was visible. Every visit she received was reminded. Every letter she sealed carries her presence farther than she herself traveled. And because her authority depends on trust rather than force, the people around her watched closely to ensure that nothing disturbs that trust. The candle beside the chapel window burns steadily. Its flame is narrow and quiet, barely moving even when footsteps pass along the hallway outside. Morning prayers have ended, yet the scent of wax and incense remains in the air. But the queen pauses here before returning to the larger halls of the palace, where visitors are already waiting. Agnes stands just behind her. She reaches forward carefully and adjusts the edge of the queen's veil so that it falls evenly across her shoulders. The movement is small, almost invisible, yet small adjustments mattered in courts like this. Clothing signaled intention, posture signaled confidence. Even the pace of a step could suggest whether a decision had already been made. Nothing inside a palace went entirely unnoticed. Widowed queens lived within a world of observation that was both gentle and constant. Courtiers watched to understand where influence was shifting. Clergy watched to ensure that mourning followed expected forms. Messengers watched for signs that alliances might change. Even visiting nobles noted how long a queen remained in conversation with certain advisors and how quickly she ended others. Watching did not always mean suspicion. Often it meant attention, because the stability of a kingdom depends on reading these signals correctly. Agnes steps back once the veil is in place. The queen nods slightly in thanks, then continues toward the audience chamber. Along the walls, servants move quietly aside to clear her path. No one speaks loudly. No one interrupts. Yet everyone present is aware that her appearance today will be remembered. Widowhood allows her to remain visible, but visibility required care. If she appeared too distant from advisors, people might wonder whether she intended to withdraw from responsibility altogether. If she appears too close to certain nobles, questions could arise about future alliances. Even accepting a gift requires attention to timing and context, so mourning became a kind of shield. It explained her presence, it explained her restraint, it explains why her authority remains connected to memory rather than ambition. Clerical writers sometimes expressed concern about how quickly widowed queens might remarry, especially when foreign courts sought alliances through marriage proposals. A remarriage could strengthen one kingdom but unsettle another. It could create new loyalties that complicate existing arrangements. For this reason, church officials often encourage careful consideration before any such decision was made. In many cases, years passed before remarriage was even discussed. During that time, mourning provided a language everyone understood. The queen enters the audience chamber now. Sunlight falls across the floor in narrow shapes that shift slowly as the mourning continues. A group of envoys stands waiting near the far wall. They bow as she approaches. Their message concerns trade along a border road that has recently become difficult to travel safely. She listens without interruption. Agnes remains behind her, watching the envoys' expressions as closely as they watch the queen's. Part of her responsibility is to notice changes in tone that others might overlook. A hesitation before answering a question, a glance exchanged between messengers, a pause that lasts slightly longer than expected. Observation worked in both directions. Courts watch the queen, but the queen's household watch the court. This balance helps maintain stability. Records from royal household sometimes describe how widowed queens continued to receive visitors regularly, even while maintaining the outward appearance of mourning. These meetings allowed them to remain informed about developments across their territories without appearing to seek power directly. Information traveled quietly through such encounters, shaping decisions long before they became visible to the wider court. The candle in the chapel window continues burning behind them. Its flame is steady because the window above it remains partly closed, protecting it from drafts. In much the same way, mourning protects the queen from sudden changes in expectation. It allows her to remain present while reducing pressure to act too quickly. Protection sometimes looked like stillness. Agnes notices a slight shift among the envoys as their conversation with the queen draws to a close. One of them lowers his voice before asking a final question about travel permissions along the southern road. The queen answers calmly, promising that the matter will be reviewed with her council before the week ends. Her reply is measured. It offers reassurance without commitment. This kind of language was familiar in courts where every promise carried weight. Beyond the chamber doors, other visitors are already waiting. Some bring petitions from distant estates. Others bring letters sealed with unfamiliar emblems. Each encounter adds another small thread to the network of relationships that surrounds the throne. And through all of it, the queen remains careful. Her veil remains in place. Her movements remain steady. Her words remain few enough to be clearly remembered. Over time, this discipline shapes how the court understands her position. She is no longer simply a widow. She becomes a figure whose restraint helps hold the balance between competing expectations, allowing the kingdom to adjust gradually to its changing circumstances. Yet, beyond the palace walls, there exists older boundaries than any court could enforce, boundaries that people believed shaped not only kingdoms, but the very structure of the world around them. In the great hall of the palace, one chair remains empty. It is not forgotten. It is not neglected. Each morning before visitors arrive, a servant steps forward with a soft cloth and gently removes the dust that settles overnight across its carved arms. The chair stands beside the raised platform where it gathers, where ambassadors' council speaks, and where decisions shape the future of the kingdom. No one sits there now, yet its presence matters. You are standing near the edge of the hall as preparations continue. The sound of footsteps echoes faintly across the stone floor. Clerks arrange parchment rolls along a narrow table. A steward checks the placement of benches where visiting nobles will soon take their seats, and still the chair remains empty. For some widowed queens, this emptiness became a choice. Not a choice made quickly, and not a choice made without consequence. remaining unmarried after a king's death meant to be alliances that might have strengthened political security in the short term. It was declining invitations that other courts sometimes considered essential. It meant accepting a quieter path that relies less on negotiation through marriage and more on presence through memory. Yet many queens chose it anyway, because widowhood could become something larger than absence. It could become a position. Across medieval Europe, royal widows sometimes remained unmarried for the rest of their lives, allowing their identity to shift gradually from consort to guardian of dynastic continuity. Their clothing remains dark. Their public appearances remained measured. Their authority rested not on new promises, but on old loyalties carefully preserved. The servant finishes dusting the chair and steps back. No announcements follow, no explanation is offered. Everyone present already understands what the chair represents. It marks the place where the king once sat. It reminds the court that his memory still shapes the order of the hall. And beside it stands the queen, decision not to remember whose memory keeps visible to everyone who enters. Historians studying royal household noticed how such choices changed the role of widowed queens over time. Without the expectation of remarriage, their position became more stable. They were no longer viewed as potential bridges between rival dynasties. Instead, they became anchors within their own kingdoms, figures whose loyalty was no longer uncertain. Nationwide influence. Because advisors trust them, clergy respected them, subjects recognized them. In some regions, widowed queens used this stability to strengthen relationships with monasteries and churches that had supported their families for generations. Gifts of land confirmed earlier promises. Endowments supported prayers offered in memory of the king. Visits to religious houses reinforced connections that extend beyond the palace walls into the spiritual life of the kingdom. These actions shaped reputation slowly. Like distant stars that travelers used for guidance at night, the presence of a widowed queen who remained faithful to her husband's memory offered direction to those uncertain about the future of the court. Her constancy suggested that change would come gradually rather than suddenly. Constancy reassured people, and reassurance helped kingdoms remain calm during periods of transition. You can hear the sound of voices gathering now as members of the council enter the hall. They paused briefly near the empty chair before taking their places along the benches. Some glance toward it without speaking. Others bow slightly as they pass. The gesture is small, but it repeats itself often enough to become tradition. In time, traditions like this shaped expectations about how widowed queens should behave. Remaining unmarried was no longer only a personal decision. It became a signal that the queen intended to protect the memory of the king rather than replace it. It told neighboring courts that her loyalties remained fixed. It told her own subjects that continuity would be preserved even as new rulers grew into their roles. The queen enters the hall quietly. Her veil falls across her shoulders in the same dark folds it has carried since the days immediately after the king's death. She pauses beside the empty chair before taking her own place slightly apart from it. Close enough to acknowledge its meaning, but far enough to show that her authority follows a different path. Now. No one questions her presence. No one asked her to explain her decision. Her stillness has already answered those questions. Over time, widowed queens who chose this path became something more than survivors of political change. They became symbols of the kingdom's memory itself, figures whose lives reminded everyone around them that authority could continue without interruption, even when rulers were gone. And as the council begins its work and voices rise gently across the hall once more, it becomes easier to see how entire societies learn to live within patterns like these. Patterns shaped not only by crowns and councils, but by older boundaries that reach far beyond the walls of any palace. Long before written laws explain where people could stand, many societies believed there were already places where you should slow your steps. You're standing beside a shallow basin of water placed just outside a sanctuary entrance. The basin is smooth from years of use. Its surface reflects a narrow strip of evening light that reaches across the courtyard and settles quietly inside it. A boy named Samir is already there. He dips his hands into the water without speaking. The motion is simple. He does not hurry, he does not splash. He lifts his hands again and lets the last drops fall back into the basin before stepping aside so the next visitor can approach. No one forces him to do this. He learned it as a child. Across many ancient societies, people believe that certain places require preparation before entry. The preparation was not meant to make them important, it was meant to make them safe. Because temples were not understood as ordinary buildings, they were places where the distance between human life and unseen forces became thinner. So before stepping inside, people washed their hands. Sometimes they washed their faces, sometimes they waited quietly for someone else to enter first. Each action creates a small pause between everyday movement and sacred movement, and over time, these pauses became habits. Mary Douglas, a careful observer of ritual traditions across cultures, once described how ideas about cleanliness often shaped social boundaries as much as physical ones. In many communities, washing before entering sacred space was not only about removing dust from the road, it was about preparing the body to cross an invisible line. Samir waits beside the basin until the courtyard grows quieter. Soon, it will be time to close the outer gate. Before that happens, one last visitor approaches the entrance carrying a small basket. Inside the basket rests a handful of grain wrapped in cloth. The visitor lowers the basket slightly while passing the basin, not as an offering yet, but as a gesture of respect before stepping closer to the inner courtyard. Even objects follow the same rules as people. Nothing entered casually. In places like this, sacred space was not separated by walls alone. It was separated by expectation. People believe that crossing certain thresholds require attention because unseen consequences could follow careless movement. These beliefs shape daily life in subtle ways. Children learned which paths led near shrines. Families learned which days required preparation before visiting temples. Travelers learned to pause before entering unfamiliar sanctuaries, where local customs guided behavior more strongly than spoken instructions. The invisible line between ordinary and sacred life became part of memory long before anyone explained it aloud. You step closer to the basin now. The water is cooler than expected. It carries the faint scent of stone and evening air. Somewhere beyond the courtyard walls, a distant bell marks the closing of a nearby market. Here, however, the sound fades more quickly. Voices grow softer. Even footsteps seem to change their rhythm as they cross the threshold. Sound behaves differently in sacred places. It slows, it settles, it waits. Temple attendants listen for these changes carefully. They knew when a courtyard had become quiet enough for evening offerings. They knew when visitors had finished preparing themselves to enter. And they knew when it was time to close the gate so that the sanctuary could rest until morning. These routines create stability. Stability creates confidence. Confidence allows communities to believe that the world remains balanced, even when uncertainty appears elsewhere. In many traditions, people also believe that certain conditions require extra preparation before approaching sacred places. Illness, grief, or travel from distant regions sometimes meant waiting longer before entering. Not because anyone was permanently disabled, but because crossing the required readiness. Readiness protected everyone involved. Samir lifts the wooden bar that closes the outer gate and settles it into place. The sound is soft but final. Evening has arrived. Inside the sanctuary, a small lamp remains burning. Outside, the courtyard returns slowly to ordinary time. Across generations, actions like these shaped how people understand the structure of their world. They believe that some places require washing, some moments required silence, some paths require patience. And by learning these patterns early, they carried an awareness of invisible boundaries with them wherever they traveled. Soon you begin to notice that these boundaries did not only shape temples, they shaped meals, gatherings, and even the way communities shared bread with another. The bowl is passed slowly from one pair of hands to another. It is not large. It holds only a modest portion of grain, yet everyone gathered around the courtyard watches its movement carefully, as though its weight were greater than it appears. The grain has already been measured once before arriving here. It has already been lifted toward the sanctuary doorway. Only then, quiet moment of acknowledgement, does it return to the circle of waiting families. Now it can be shared. You're standing beside the edge of the gathering as the evening light fades across the packed earth beneath your feet. The air smells faintly of baked bread and wood smoke from nearby hearths. Children remain close to their parents. No one steps forward too quickly. Because in sacred meals like this, order mattered. An elderly steward named Hiram kneels beside a low wooden table and begins dividing the bread. His hands move with patience learned across many seasons. He does not look at the bread while he works. Instead, he looks at the people waiting before him, calling them forward in a sequence everyone recognizes without needing to ask. First come the elders, then the families who prepare the offering, then the others gathered to share what remained. This order is not written anywhere on the walls. It lives in memory. Across many ancient communities, meals connected to temples or seasonal festivals followed patterns like these. Food was never only nourishment, it was a sign that the relationship between people and the unseen forces they trusted remained steady. Sharing food means belonging. And wearing clothes creates safety. In agricultural societies especially, the success of each harvest depends on cooperation as much as weather. Families worked fields together, they stored grain together, they protected irrigation channels together. Sacred meals reminded everyone that survival depends on those maintaining relationships carefully across the year. Hiram lifts another piece of bread and places it into waiting hands. No one speaks loudly while the distribution continues. Even the children watch quietly, understanding that this meal follows a different rhythm from ordinary evenings. Here, each portion carries more than taste. It carries acknowledgement, it carries reassurance. It carries memory of earlier gatherings when the same bread was shared in the same order beneath the same fading light. In some places, these meals mark the beginning of planting seasons. In others, they followed the end of harvest. The timing changed, but the meaning remained similar. People gathered to confirm that they still stand inside a shared world shaped by cooperation rather than uncertainty. Grain made this possible. Across the Mediterranean and the Near Eastern regions, grain formed the foundation of daily life. It could be stored, it could be transported, it could be measured and divided without losing its value. Because of this, it became the natural center of many ritual gatherings. Offering grain before sharing it creates a bridge between survival and gratitude. The bowl returns to Hiram again. He tilts it slightly, checking what remains before continuing the distribution. Even the smallest portion is placed carefully. Nothing is dropped. Nothing is wasted. The attention given to each piece reflects the belief that the act of sharing mattered as much as the food itself. Anthropologists studying ritual meals across many cultures later observed that these gatherings often reinforced social structure gently rather than forcefully. People learned where they stood in the community not through commands, but through participation. They saw who served first. They saw who waited longer. They saw who carried the bowls and who received them. Hierarchy appeared quietly, and because it appeared quietly, it felt natural. You can hear the low sound of conversation returning as the meal continues. Someone begins telling a story about the previous year's harvest. Another voice answers with a memory of a storm that nearly damaged the irrigation channels before the planting season began. Laughter moves softly across the circle, never rising high enough to disturb the rhythm of the evening. Food creates space for stories. Stories create space for trust. Trust allows communities to remain steady even when seasons change. In some traditions, special foods were prepared only for these gatherings and never eaten at other times of the year. Their taste alone reminded people that they were participating in something larger than ordinary life. A familiar flavor could carry memory across generations without needing explanation. As the last pieces of bread are shared, Hiram wipes his hands slowly on a folded cloth and sets the empty bowl back onto the table. The courtyard grows quieter again. Families begin preparing to return home, carrying with them the reassurance that the bonds between them remain intact for another season. Long after the food itself is gone, the memory of its sharing continues to shape how people greet each other in the days that follow. Because sacred meals were never only about hunger. They were about order. They were about belonging. And they were about the quiet understanding that every community depends on invisible agreements that could not be written but could always be tasted. Elsewhere, however, not every ritual depends on bread and grain. Some depend on endurance, patience, and the moment when a person crossed from one stage of life into another. The fire has already been burning for some time. Its light does not leap wildly into the air. Instead, it settles into a steady glow that reaches outward in a slow circle across the ground. Around it, people sit quietly, leaving space in the center where no one steps until the moment arrives. You are standing just beyond the edge of the circle. The woven cord rests loosely around your wrist. It is simple in appearance, made from fibers twisted together earlier in the day by hands that did not hurry while working. Someone placed it there without explanation. No one told you what would happen next, but everyone present understands what the cord means. It marks the beginning of waiting. In many ancient communities, initiation did not begin with movement, it began with stillness. Those who stood beside the fire were asked not to prove strength in dramatic ways. Instead, they were asked to remain patient while others watched quietly, measuring readiness through time rather than action. Waiting itself was part of the crossing. The elders seated nearby speak in low voices that blend with the soft sound of wood settling deeper into the fire. Their conversation is not meant to be secret. It was meant to be steady. The initiate listens without interruption, learning through presence rather than instruction. Across cultures separated by distance and language, rituals like this followed patterns that were surprisingly similar. A young person approaching adults often steps away from ordinary routines for a short period. During that time, familiar clothing might change. Ordinary meals might be shared differently. New objects, like the cord around your wrist, appeared quietly and remained until the ceremony ended. These objects stayed long after the fire was gone. They became reminders. The anthropologists studying such workshops noticed that visible signs of belonging helped communities recognize change without needing to explain it repeatedly. A bracelet, a garment, or a mark worn on the body told others that the initiate had crossed a boundary that could not easily be reversed. Belonging had become visible. The fire cracks once, sending a small line of sparks upward before settling again. No one moves toward the center yet. The delay is intentional. It allows the moment to gather weight slowly, like clouds forming before a distant storm. Storms do not announce themselves immediately. They approach through changes in air and light that people learn to recognize long before the first drop of rain arrives. Initiation followed a similar rhythm. The young initiate aside you shift slightly, not from discomfort, but from attention. The cord around his wrist catches the firelight and darkens again as his arm lowers. He's been waiting longer than he expected. Yet, no one urges him forward. The silence around him is part of what he must carry across the boundary. In some traditions, this waiting ends with a shared meal. In others, it ended with a blessing spoken quietly by an elder. Sometimes it ended simply with the moment when the initiate stepped forward and stood beside the fire while others watched. The act itself was often simple. The meaning stayed. Communities believe that change requires recognition, not explanation. When someone crossed into a new stage of life, everyone present became a witness. That shared witnessing allows the transformation to belong not only to the initiate, but to the entire group. Responsibility moves outward in circles, like the light of the fire spreading across the ground. The elders have risen now. One of them steps forward carrying another cord, slightly thicker than the first. He ties it beside the original bracelet without speaking. The gesture takes only a few seconds, yet it changes how everyone in the circle understands what has happened. The initiate is no longer waiting. He has arrived. Across many societies, ceremonies like this create a quiet moment when identity changes shape without conflict or argument. The community agreed together that the boundary had been crossed. From that evening forward, the initiate would be greeted differently, trusted differently, and expected to participate in decisions that once belonged only to others. Endurance made belonging visible. Not endurance of hardship alone, but endurance of attention, patience, and recognition. The fire burns are lower now. Voices begin to return slowly as the circle loosens and families prepare to walk home beneath the evening sky. The initiate lifts his arm once more, studying the cords that now rest against his skin. They are light enough to forget during ordinary tasks, yet strong enough to remain for many seasons. Their presence will speak for him long after the ceremony ends. Across generations, rituals like this help communities mark change without confusion. They allowed people to move from childhood to responsibility, from outsider to participant, from learner to witness. And nowhere were invisible boundaries treated with more care than in the quiet presence of the dead, where distance itself became a form of protection. The lamp is placed near the doorway before anyone else arrives. Its flame is small and steady, sheltered by a shallow rim of clay that protects it from sudden drafts. It does not brighten the entire room. It marks a boundary. You are standing just outside the entrance of a house where voices have already fallen quiet. The courtyard beyond the doorway feels different from the street behind you. People approach slowly. Some pause before stepping across the threshold. Others lower their voices even before they reach the lamp. A woman named Lale stops beside it now. She does not enter immediately. Instead, she waited a moment with her hands folded loosely together, watching the flame settle into its calm rhythm. No one has told her to stop here. She learned this pause long ago, like in the same way others learn to wash their hands before entering a sanctuary or to wait before receiving shared bread during a festival meal. Some thresholds asked for stillness. The presence of the dead was one of them. Across many ancient societies, death was understood not only as an ending, but as a transition that required careful attention from the living. Families prepared bodies with quiet gestures that followed familiar patterns. Lamps were placed near doorways. Water was brought for washing hands after visits. Curtains were drawn differently. Voices softened without instruction. These actions did not remove grief. They shaped it, because people believed that the boundary between the living and the dead was delicate, and that crossing it carelessly could disturb more than memory. Lala steps inside now. The air smells faintly of oil and linen. Someone has opened a narrow window to allow evening air to move gently through the room. Near the far wall, relatives sit together in silence, their hands resting quietly in their laps. No one speaks first. Words arrive slowly in places like this. The lamp remains near the doorway behind her. It reminds each visitor that entry requires attention. In many communities, families follow careful routines after a death to maintain balance between remembrance and distance. Washing hands after leaving the house of mourning was common in several regions around the Mediterranean and the Near East. The gesture did not suggest fear of the dead themselves. Instead, it marks the transition back into ordinary life, helping visitors carry respect with them without carrying uncertainty as well. Distance creates clarity. Clarity created calm. Anthropologists studying such customs later observed that beliefs about the presence of the dead often encourages communities to move slowly during periods of mourning. Objects used by the deceased might remain untouched for a time. Rooms might stay arranged as they had been on the final day. Lamps might burn through the night as quiet companions to memory. These gestures allow the living to adjust gradually. They also allowed ancestors to remain present in ways that feel familiar rather than unsettling. In some households, families speak to the dead during certain seasons of the year, offering food or lighting additional lamps near burial places. These acts did not attempt to call the dead back. They confirmed that relationships continued in quieter forms. Memory became a bridge. Lala sits beside the others now. Someone places a small bowl of water near the entrance so that visitors leaving later will remember to pause again before stepping outside. The bowl reflects the lamp's flame in a narrow line of light that trembles gently across its surface. Even water participates in these boundaries. Like the basin beside the sanctuary doorway you passed earlier, it reminded people that certain moments required preparation before crossing from one space into another. The careful handling of the dead-shaped communities entire in subtle ways. It influenced where houses were built. It influences how roads near burial grounds. It influences how families gathered during particular seasons of remembrance. These patterns help people live beside memory without allowing grief to overwhelm daily life. Silence, in places like this, was not emptiness. It was structure. It guides how long visitors stayed. It guided when conversations resumed. It guides how children learn to recognize the difference between ordinary evenings and evenings marked by loss. Outside the doorway, night has begun to settle across the courtyard. The lamp's flame appears brighter now against the darkening walls. One by one, visitors step back across the threshold, pausing briefly beside the bowl of water before returning to the street. Each pause repeats the same quiet gesture. Respect on the way in, balance on the way out. Across generations, rituals like these communities allow to live with the presence of the dead without fear. They create a path between memory and movement, between grief and continuation, between what remains visible and what had passed beyond sight. And sometimes, there were rulers who did not simply observe these boundaries, but learned how to step across them carefully, carrying memory and authority together as they moved between worlds. Before you ever heard her name, you heard the bell. It hangs from a leather strap beside the neck of a camel, moving slowly along a pale road that stretches toward the horizon. The sound it makes is not loud. It repeats gently, once with each careful step, steady enough that travelers begin to measure distance by its rhythm rather than by the landscape around them. You are approaching Palmyra. From far away, the city appears almost like a mirage rising from the edge of the desert. Columns stand in long rows that catch the light differently depending on the hour. Towers rise above burial grounds beyond the main road. And between them stretches a wide avenue where traders from distant regions once walked beside Roman officials without needing to choose between them. Palmyra was not only a city, it was a meeting place between worlds. Under the shade of a stone archway near the market quarter, a clerk named Barate kneels beside several bundles of folded silk. He unties each cord slowly, checks the edges of the cloth, and records their arrival on a narrow tablet before passing them forward to another attendant who will carry them deeper into the storage rooms nearby. Each bundle has traveled farther than most people who touch it. Some began their journey beyond the eastern deserts. Others crossed river valleys before joining caravan routes that eventually reached Palmyra's gates. From here, they could continue west toward Roman cities along the Mediterranean coast, or remain in the markets where traders negotiate agreements that connect entire regions through trade. Barate's task is simple. He counts. Yet counting matters in a place like this, because Palmyra stood at a crossroads where languages changed from one street to another. Greek appears beside Aramaic on inscriptions. Roman titles appear beside older local names. Contracts moved between systems of law that did not always describe authority in the same way, yet still managed to cooperate long enough for trade to continue. This cooperation requires careful balance. The city did not belong entirely to Rome, yet it remains closely connected to Roman administration. It did not abandon its Eastern traditions, yet it welcomed officials who represented imperial authority. Instead of choosing one identity, Palmyra learned to weave several together. Like threads crossing inside a patterned cloth, each strand strengthens the others without disappearing into them. Travelers entering the city quickly noticed this mixture. Columns built in Roman-style lined streets where merchants spoke languages carried from far beyond the empire's eastern frontier. Temples honored local gods whose names had been known in the desert long before Roman soldiers first passed through the region. Yet nearby stood buildings where imperial orders were received and answered with careful attention. The balance was visible everywhere. Barate finishes counting the silk bundles and ties them again with practiced hands. Nearby, another clerk records the arrival of spices stored in narrow jars sealed with wax. Each entry becomes part of a larger network of information that allows caravans to continue moving safely between distant markets. Safety here depends on movement rather than stillness. Caravans brought news as well as goods. They carried stories about border conditions, river crossings, and political changes far beyond the city's walls. Merchants arriving in Palmyra often knew more about distant territories than soldiers stationed closer to them, simply because they traveled farther and listened carefully along the way. This made the city valuable. Roman authorities recognized its importance as a partner that could help maintain stability along the eastern frontier without requiring constant military presence. Local leaders that recognized cooperation with Rome allowed trade to continue without interruption from conflicts that might otherwise have closed the roads entirely. So, Palmyra developed a habit of standing between worlds without leaning too heavily toward either one. Standing between worlds required skill. It meant learning how to greet Roman envoys with formal respect while continuing to honor older traditions within the city's own temples. It meant allowing caravan leaders to negotiate prices freely while ensuring that agreements still followed structures recognized by imperial officials. It meant speaking more than one language without losing the meaning of either. Children growing up here heard several languages before they were old enough to travel beyond the gates. They learned that identity could stretch without breaking, be the way woven cloth stretches when pulled gently along its length. Barate rises now and carries his tablet toward another archway where a steward waits to confirm the day's records. Behind him, the caravan bell sounds again as another group of animals enters the market quarter. The sound blends with voices calling greetings across the street and with the low movement of wind passing between the columns. In places like this, boundaries were not walls, they were paths. Paths that allow people to move carefully between different kinds of authority without needing to abandon one for the other. And into this careful balance, shaped by trade, language, and patience across generations, stepped a woman unusually prepared to understand how such boundaries could be crossed without breaking them. Ida. Long before she appeared beside soldiers or ambassadors, Zenobia listened. The room where she sits is not large. Its walls are lined with wooden shelves that hold rolled scrolls tied with thin cords. Light enters through a narrow opening high above the floor, settling softly across a reading cushion placed near a low table. Next to the cushion rests a narrow case made to protect parchment during travel. Inside the case are texts written in more than one language. This is not unusual in Palmyra. Children growing up here often heard several languages spoken before they were old enough to read them. Traders arrived from the east carrying words shaped far beyond the desert. Roman officials brought Latin titles that appear beside Greek translations in public inscriptions. A local speech continued to carry older sounds that had been familiar in the region for generations. Zenobia learned to move between these voices easily. Later writers remembered her as someone who could speak with scholars in Greek, communicate with administrators using Roman terms when necessary, and remain fully at home in the language spoken across Palmyra's own streets. Whether every detail of those accounts can be confirmed is less important than what they suggest about how her education was understood by people who tried to explain her rise afterward. They believed knowledge protected her. Knowledge allows her to travel across boundaries that others hesitated to cross. A historian seated nearby unrolls a scroll and begins reading aloud. The story he reads concerns an earlier queen from Egypt, whose name had already traveled across centuries by the time Zenobia heard it. The reading is slow and careful. Names are repeated, places are described, events are placed into sequence so that memory can follow them without confusion. Zenobia listens without interrupting. She does not treat the story as distant. In cities like Palmyra, history was not only about the past, it was about examples. Learning how earlier rulers acted allowed later ones to imagine how authority might appear again under different conditions. Writers from the Roman world later claimed that Zenobia traced connections between her own position and earlier queens, reminded for their strength and independence. One such connection linked her symbolically to Cleopatra of Egypt, whose reputation still carries weight across the Eastern Mediterranean. Whether this claim reflected genealogy or political storytelling, it helped shape how observers interpreted Zenobia's ambitions. Lineage could be spoken as easily as it could be inherited. The historian pauses while adjusting the scroll. Outside the room, footsteps pass along the corridor where attendants carry messages between officials, discuss trade routes, and patrol movements along the frontier. These conversations belong to another part of the palace, yet they are not far away. Zenobia's education prepares her for both rooms. In one room, she listened to histories that explained how rulers presented themselves to distant courts. In another, she observed how agreements were negotiated between caravan leaders and Roman representatives responsible for maintaining stability across the region. Learning moved between these spaces the way stars move across the night sky. Some appeared close, others appeared distant. Together, they formed patterns that travelers learned to follow when crossing unfamiliar ground. Education works in the same way. Each language she learned became another point of orientation. Each historical account she studied became another reference she could use when speaking with visitors from outside Palmyra. Each example of earlier queenship became another path she might follow if circumstances required her to step forward rather than remain behind. The parchment scroll case beside her holds more than one text. It holds preparation. The preparation did not always appear dramatic in the moment. It appeared as listening. It appeared as repeating unfamiliar words until they sounded natural. It appears as asking careful questions about events that had taken place long before she was born. Yet later, observers recognized how important this preparation became. Modern researchers studying Zenobia's court have suggested that her education helped her communicate with Roman officials without appearing unfamiliar with their expectations, while also maintaining credibility among local elites who value older traditions. Moving between these audiences requires attention to language as much as to policy. Language 1. Constituency anxiety means survival. The historian finishes reading and rolls the scroll closed again. Zenobia remains seated for a moment longer, while her attention resting on the last name spoken aloud before the room returns to silence. Outside the window, the afternoon light has shifted slightly, marking the slow passage of time across the palace walls. Soon, she will rise and join others in a different chamber where discussions concern matters closer to the present than the stories she has just heard. For now, she listens once more, because learning, like starlight, often travels long distances before anyone realizes how far it has already reached. And after her husband's death, the knowledge she carried quietly for years would begin to shape decisions that carried her influence far beyond the boundaries of the city where she first learned to listen.